right, welcome back to MetFlex and Chill. This is your host, Rachel Gregory, and I'm here with my good friend, Kristi Storoschuk. How are you doing today?
I'm very well, Rachel. Thanks so much for having me on. How are you?
I'm good. I'm excited to chat with you. Before we dive into all the fun things we're going to talk about today, do you want to give our listeners a little bit of your background, kind of tell us who you are, what you do, how you got to where you are today, all that fun stuff?
All right. Well, that could take a really long time, but I'll make it very brief.
Okay.
Yeah. So I am a science writer. I work in the ketogenic space as a communicator, science communicator, and my health journey started when I was very young. I grew up working at my grandparents' supplement store, so we had like a little mom and pop health food shop, and I worked every summer there from when I was like 12 years old. So I was exposed to the natural health world at a very young age, and my dream was always to be a naturopathic doctor. So I set up like my undergrad and everything in the direction of naturopathic medicine. When I was in university, I ended up just being really interested in research, and I've always been interested in diet, and I've experimented with my own diet several times,
Yeah.
like a very young age. So I've always been interested in nutrition, and then I started learning about the ketogenic diet. And when I was in my science undergrad, I could actually understand science and know that a ketogenic diet was associated with real biomarkers that you could follow in the body, and that was super intriguing to me. And the idea that a diet could be used in a medical application was really cool because it was just a clear example of food as medicine. And so I was very, very interested in that and wanted to go into research I wanted to join a lab that was studying the ketogenic diet. So I reached out to basically all the professors in the States that was studying the ketogenic diet, and Dom D'Agostino ended up replying to me, and he didn't have any room in his lab at the time when I reached out for new students, but he at the time was looking to expand his online platforms, and I had just graduated, I was going to travel, and it was a great opportunity for me. He gave me just to be like, hey, if you want to submit blog articles and be in charge of the educational portion of my brand, then you can have it. So that's kind of how I got into the space, and I just graduated university and dove into the research on ketogenic nutrition, but it was really with a therapeutic lens, which was really awesome because that's what I was very passionate about, which kind of separates what I do from from the ketogenic space on a broad scale, because it's very focused on weight loss and body composition and that kind of stuff. Whereas I started in this space looking at it purely therapeutic, and it's been a really cool journey since then. And it's like almost reaching 3 years now that I've been working directly with Dom, and become close friends with people in the lab and worked on different projects with them. So it's been a really cool journey, but it started very young, just being interested in food and holistic health.
That's super cool. That's super cool. And I definitely want to dive into we'll talk about keto in the sense of like the therapeutic realm, because I think that is something, like you said, it's like a lot of people hear keto, and I mean, I think in the mainstream, obviously not in the space that we're in, but your general person who hears keto, it's like automatically that goes to like weight loss or fat loss, or like even negatives like, oh, that's too restrictive or whatever it may be. And they don't really understand like the actual metabolic and therapeutic benefits of being in a state of ketosis, especially for, treating disease states and things like that. So I think that is something, like the education behind that is super important for people to understand, because you say this all the time, like keto isn't a diet, like it's a metabolic state, like ketosis is a metabolic state. So
Right.
anyway, that's something I love to kind of clear up when people say, oh, it's, that's just a diet that's restrictive or whatever. And it's like, no, it's a little bit more than that. And if you have like a specific reason why you'd want to embark on that or whatever, and we can chat about all this, there's so many different benefits. So anyway,
Right.
before we dive into that, I do want to dive into a little bit more of like your journey, because I know that you and myself are very similar in terms of experimenting with all different types of protocols. Like we love just geeking out on all this stuff. And so I know that you've had like specific time periods and things that you've gone through in terms of, experimenting with keto and carnivore and kind of that journey. So do you want to tell us a little bit about maybe over the past few years what you've experimented with, things that you've found in terms of your own health and all of that?
Yeah, for sure. So originally when I was like 15, 16 years old, I went vegan because at the time veganism was going to save our health, the planet, and everything else. It was like the be all end all. I was also 16 and very, just very like I was easily impressionated by these things. So anyways, started with that. And then I started doing CrossFit, and the diet at the time when I started CrossFit was like pushing paleo really hard. So I was like, oh, okay, I'll go paleo. And so I switched to paleo, and then that kind of transitioned into more of a plant-based paleo diet. And because I was really just not eating dairy, not eating grains, but I wasn't eating a lot of meat. So it was really just like fruits and vegetables and nuts. It was not a very
So still
well.
like vegan paleo? Paleo
Yeah,
vegan?
it was like a paleo vegan diet. And then I started I started learning about the ketogenic diet. So I
Mm-hmm.
started that and did it for myself. And I was very plant-based keto at the time as well. And then this whole carnivore movement kind of triggered that experimental side of me. I was like, oh, I'm intrigued by this. Like, because I've never been attached to a diet for any sort of ethical reasons or
Mm-hmm.
that kind of stuff. It was all just like based on my body. And it's interesting because I never felt bad on any diet. Like, there was never like, oh, veganism didn't work for me or
Mm-hmm.
those kind of things. It was more just because I was so young and I was athletic, and I think that I could just, and I wasn't doing them for like years on end. Like max was like 1 or 2 years that I would stay strict on a certain diet. So I never really got like experienced any consequences of any sort of eating behavior. But now looking back, I'm like, oh, maybe if I sustained a vegan diet, it could have led to nutrient deficiencies, which
Mm-hmm.
I'm pretty convinced of. And the carnivore movement has really exploited that area of nutrition and just really reframed my view on nutrition, because I now view animal foods as a very nutrient dense source of like animal protein and all the nutrients that come with it in their bioavailable form. My view on meat has completely changed, and the carnivore, like I did 30 days of carnivore just to give it a shot, and it really changed my mind of how what role animal proteins play in my diet. I learned so much about my body in terms of satiety and just appetite regulation and my relationship with food,
Mm-hmm.
and how I use food as just to fill time out of boredom. It's not like a
Same.
coping strategy in any way, but when I was doing carnivore, I was like, I just lost the desire to eat in terms of like snacking and stuff. It was like when mealtime rolled around, it was like I got to enjoy a really delicious, calorically dense, fatty, just delicious meal, and then I wasn't thinking about food after. Whereas find even if calories are matched, if my meals are very plant based, I still have room to eat with the same amount of calories. And I mean, you could argue like, oh, protein is a big role in that, but at the same time, I don't know. I just find my digestion was so much better with an all meat diet. Not saying that I'm going to do it long term or that I don't think that there are consequences to a long term carnivore diet, but I just think that understanding the role that animal proteins can play in your diet in terms of nutrients and satiety, I think that was very revolutionary for me. And it's made me think of how people approach diet as well, because we do live I mean, you and I live in a bubble where we
Mm-hmm.
understand animal proteins and we understand the satiety effect of proteins. But most people don't understand that, and they also just view plants as like this safe food. It's like, how could a plant-based diet be bad? Like, it's just plants. Like, there's nothing dangerous about them. There's nothing that, like, how could someone be unhealthy on a plant-based diet? But what I think is sort of the wrong context in the weight loss and the health space is this view on calories, and plants. So
Mm-hmm.
what I found for myself is that if I was to ever focus on just calories and like low fat foods, because low fat foods contain less calories just based on fat being the most
Mm-hmm.
calorically dense macronutrient, I feel like people eat more by focusing on calories than they would if they just focused on nutrient density and satiety, because I could eat like 800 calories of like fatty like oxtail or like something super like decadent and
Mm-hmm.
fatty and calorically dense. But if I'm not eating for 8 hours until my next meal, it's and then like I feel good digestive wise, I have mental clarity, I'm like it's not making me like bloated and feeling uncomfortable, then I would way choose that really high calorie meal over like a lower calorie plant-based meal that maybe like it's just like reframing the focus.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
No, yeah, it does make sense. And that's something that like so I did a 30-day carnivore experiment too, a
Oh,
while
awesome.
back. I think it was like a year ago now, maybe. And I definitely noticed like all the benefits of like what you're saying, satiety. I mean, so for me, like I did notice the satiety part of it, but I think more it was more mental, like in terms of having more volume. So like I've always been a volume eater. Like my entire life, I was literally the kid who was like, "Give me more vegetables," just because I loved broccoli. Like I don't know, I just loved eating a lot. And my mom always used to say my eyes are always bigger than my stomach because I would like literally get a huge plate of food and then I wouldn't be able to finish it, but like I would just want all the food. And I don't know if that's just like ingrained in me, but I've just always been a volume eater. So when I went carnivore, it was like I think I was probably like fighting myself too in terms of like fighting the mental kind of burden that I've always not burden, but that I've always just been a volume eater. So it was a little bit
Yeah.
more difficult for me, and for me, it just wasn't sustainable because I do like kind of eating a lot and like having like a big, like obviously protein first, but then having like vegetables and stuff like that. But anyway,
No,
going
I totally agree with you. And
yeah,
I'm actually 100% the same. Like I will make salads like the size of my torso.
yeah,
Because I like the act of eating and
hmm
taking time to eat, and that it makes you eat slower, etc.
yeah,
There's lots of benefits to that as well. But I just think that forcing myself to do carnivore also made me realize that I could be full off very small portion sizes, and it wasn't really about the volume other than that I just enjoyed it, and I do
yeah.
enjoy vegetables too. So I
Yeah.
definitely see where you're coming from, and I agree 100%.
Yeah. No, and I think it just comes down to like going through that process and like experimenting, right? Like for anybody, they can go through a period of time where they do carnivore and try it out, and you don't have to have like a specific reason. I know a lot of people, with these different types of diet protocols, whether it's keto, low fat, whatever it is, it's like people are like, all right, I need to, you have a very sense of like going into a specific diet for a specific reason in terms of usually it's fat loss. Like for most people,
Hmm.
they're going to go on quote unquote on a diet for, unless we're in like the bubble that we're in, like you said.
Yeah.
But it's like, you don't have to, it doesn't have to be for fat loss or whatever that is. Like you can just experiment to see how you feel. So I think with carnivore, like I think there is a lot of like positives and negatives around people how how they view it. Like if you're kind of outside of this nutrition space and you're looking in, you're like, I'm never gonna just eat meat. Like what? That doesn't make sense. But just being open to that, I think that's just super important. But anyway, now I'm just going down rabbit hole. But I do want to. So you did carnivore. How long ago was the 30-day experiment?
It was actually a year ago, like
Okay.
yesterday.
Oh, cool. Yeah. So I guess maybe bring us through like what you found. Like you told us all about like the satiety factor, but then kind of moving forward, are you continuing carnivore? Like, did you? I know you tried some other things over the past year, so I don't want to give it away, but I want you to tell us about that and kind of, um, yeah, just continue before I interrupted you. Interrupt.
No, no worries. Um, yeah, like another major thing that I noticed on the carnivore diet, because I was going to CrossFit basically 6 times a week while I was
Mhm.
doing the 30-day carnivore. And at first, it was like immediately as soon as I went carnivore, I lost all explosive power in the gym. I was doing box jumps and I was like, oh my gosh, my legs are just not lifting. Like, I don't get it. Like, come on. I like as hard as I
Yeah.
told my legs to lift, they wouldn't. And so the next day, I actually got this from you. I took a shot of Redmond salt
Oh.
and I just like put it in a teaspoon and took a shot of it the next day before my CrossFit class, and there was running in the class that day, and I felt 100% different, and from then on I ended up just taking a shot of salt before every single workout. Except for there was a couple days when I forgot and it came back like immediately.
Mm.
So I noticed that electrolytes were super important on a zero carb diet, even though I transitioned from a keto diet. So I must have been eating like a ton of vegetables before that's were supplying me with like magnesium and
Mhm.
all the electrolytes that we need. Because I really noticed the difference when I went zero carb. So electrolytes were super important. Other than that, yeah, I think it was just like the mental reframing of how I view portion sizes and how many times a day I really need to eat, the caloric density of meals, like why I feel way more comfortable just eating a very calorie dense meal. Not that I've ever focused on calories. It's just like, I feel like everyone looks at a meal and be like, what? That's 1,000 calories? I'm not going to eat that in one sitting. And it's like, well, yeah, but if you only eat that twice a day, then you're at 2,000 calories. And what's the difference between that and spreading it out over 6 meals? Like, I actually felt way more comfortable doing that in terms of my digestion, just because I overeat vegetables. Like, my problem has never been like overeating junk food. I know I don't eat junk food. It's literally been like, I can overeat vegetables.
I do. We're like the same.
Yeah.
And yeah, and that can have its issues in itself because, like you said, bloating and all of that. Like, can you tell us a little bit, maybe just like a really quick synopsis of because you talked about how people say like, oh, vegetables aren't bad, like there's nothing bad in vegetables, but can there be, like, can you consume too much? And like, in terms of like the nutrients in vegetables, and kind of, can you just like talk a little bit about that in the sense of like, maybe there are not dangers to vegetables, but like some things in vegetables that may not be as amazing as everybody, puts out to, I guess.
All plants have their own anti-nutrients in them. And I've never experienced any like toxicity load of an anti-nutrient, but there are people that have, so like oxalate toxicity, or just, so we know that can contribute to ketone, oh my gosh, kidney stones. Mixing up kidney and ketones, kidney stones, and because they bind up calcium. And and I just don't think that people on plant-based diets or highly plant-based diets, they don't associate like their digestive issues with the plants, because I feel like we just have this barrier up. It's like, no, plants can't be the issue. Plants can't be the issue. And I'm not saying remove all plants from the diet. Like, I don't think a carnivore diet is sustainable long-term for anyone. I just think that it's a cool tool to have in your toolbox.
Exactly.
But yeah, so I know that there is lots of people online complaining about bloating, and I'm like, you probably are eating a ton of like raw veggies and just like cauliflower, broccoli, Brussels sprouts, all these cruciferous vegetables. Like, they do have compounds in them that do encourage bloating. And it's hard for us to wrap our head around how reducing plants could be better when we've always been told to eat more.
Yeah. No, I agree. I think it's, and it's like and this is something too with, that I've noticed, like just working with other clients there, in the past, it's like when I do give them a macro goal or something like that, they're like, okay, well, do vegetables count for this? Because it is, that volume, right? That's filling you up, and it's probably causing bloating, but vegetables they all still have calories and all of that. And like, there is obviously fiber and some of that stuff that doesn't get digested and whatever. We don't have to go down that rabbit hole, but I think just exactly what you said, like, there are pros and cons to pretty much everything. So it's just like reframing your mindset and just being open to like learning more about it. And like, I think that's why the carnivore movement is so cool, because it's something that's never really happened before. And so it's like, it's getting people interested, like, okay, like, what is this? There's people getting benefits besides just, the fat loss, body composition side of things. So yeah, I think that's.
And then I didn't even mention like the problems with like grains and all of these actual like refined carbohydrates, those types of plant foods. Because when I think of plants, I'm like, okay, lettuce, broccoli, like this type of keto, like low carb plants that we would eat. But most of the population are eating these like very destructive compounds. Like, and we know that paleomedicine out of Hungary, they are curing and helping many patients on a purely carnivore diet, and it all comes down to the gut barrier and leaky gut and promoting like reducing gut permeability, because that just lets toxins into our blood. They can bind to our joints. They can cause all these systemic problems that all start in the gut. And it's these plant compounds a lot of the time, like gluten, which is like, it's almost like we are all like, oh, gluten, whatever. That's like gluten-free diet. That's old news. But gluten is causing a lot of problems in a lot of people's diets. And it is comes down to the gut barrier, and leaky gut is associated with so many chronic inflammatory diseases. So I think there is something to, well, actually, I do strongly believe there is something to like reducing grains in the diet, and especially refined carbohydrates and sugars. So that it's always funny when I talk to people in this keto space, because when we forget that like people still eat bread, and
Yeah.
like there's like a large part of society still eating these foods. And
Yeah.
but anyways, I'm digressing here.
No.
Move on.
I agree. And I think, yeah, I mean, this podcast is all about like, finding more of obviously metabolic flexibility and kind of that whole concept. And we'll talk about that in a second, but just kind of finding what works for you. And I think it all comes down to, you have to experiment, right? You have to see what works for you. You can't just have someone else, like you can have someone else, guide you and help you to find that. But it all comes back to like, all right, what makes you feel the best? What gives you the results that you're looking for? And also realizing that that's going to probably change over time as develop and as you change things, as you grow and age and all of that. So I
Totally.
think, yeah.
Couldn't agree more with that statement. But
So,
also, I just want to say that even though I did carnivore for myself, I'm no like carnivore expert. I am just talking from experience. So,
no, I love it. I love it. So I know didn't you do like after the carnivore experiment, you did like a higher carb experiment? Or am I making it
well,
in my head?
we can transition into
Yes,
my
let's.
own health journey, which does involve adding some carbs into my diet. So, I mean, I have to kind of backstory. So I
Sure.
was on a plant-based diet, and then I went off the pill, lost my period, didn't have a period for about 18 months, and then I went keto, and within a month I got my period back. Just switching to a ketogenic diet. It was still highly plant-based at the time, but I was like, oh my gosh, I found the solution. It's
Yeah.
keto. So I stayed on a ketogenic diet for a really long time. And I didn't get my period for another few months. I was still highly plant-based, and it was really weird. One day I was craving red meat, so I went to Whole Foods and bought some beef and some beef liver, and I ate it, and literally the next week I got my period after like 4 months of not having it from my initial one, which was very interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And so anyways, I kind of associated that with maybe I need some more red meat in my diet. Time goes on, still irregular period, even though I'm on a ketogenic diet. And I was maintaining a weight that was very low, and I knew that my period was coming every time I was getting it, even though it was irregular. It was coming when I was fluctuating between like eating more than usual.
Mm-hmm.
And so I knew inherently that I was just at a low body fat percentage. And it's weird. I've never had like an eating disorder or body image issues or anything, but it is kind of, it messes with your mind when society praises you for being thin. And so not that it was very challenging for me to gain weight. I knew like, I was like, okay, I have to do this for my health. Having no period is not good. Like no woman should ever feel comfortable with the fact that they haven't had a period in a year or 6 months or 4 months. There's a problem going on. Your menstrual cycle is a vital sign of your overall health. And I think we need to normalize that and talk about it more, because it's something women can hide. So if like we're looking at all these girls on Instagram who are flaunting their skinny bodies in bikinis, and then other girls are trying to copy that and they're damaging their body just to look like that, it's very, very damaging to younger women. So I think that is a really big message that I think more people should talk about, just because it's going to set females up for long-term problems. Anyways, so I was like, hey, this is it. I'm hit my last straw. I'm going to increase carbs. I'm going to gain some weight. I'm just going to remove all sorts of restrictions that not like just restrictions that I was following by second nature. Like I was just eating a ketogenic diet by second nature at that point. So I started cycling in carbs and just was eating as much as I wanted. Like all hours of the day. I was like, if I'm hungry in the morning, I'm going to eat breakfast at 8 a.m., which I'm not used to. I usually eat at 12. And so I was just doing all things that I wasn't normally doing, even though it was still like healthy carbs. Like my carb sources were like squashes and sweet potatoes and maybe like a paleo cookie with some honey or something in it. So I was still sticking to a whole foods diet, just increasing carbs and having no rules on fasting and etc. So I gained 10 pounds pretty fast, and my period came back, and now it's becoming more regular within the last this was like 6 months ago that I made these changes. So
Okay.
it's definitely been becoming way more regular since I've put on about 10 pounds. And now I kind of transitioned back to a normal, like normalcy, because I found that eating so many calories was just messing with everything in my life. Like my sleep was messed up. I would wake up with like a hangover type feeling, and I was not enjoying it actually. Like at first I was like, sweet, all the food. And after that I was like, hey, I could have done this in a way more sustainable way. But now I'm back to intermittent fasting. I just really love intermittent fasting. It adds so much value to my life. I just can't imagine waking up and eating breakfast. Like it just doesn't sit well with me. With that said, I have made changes around my eating window and my fasting window that support my higher body weight, and also I can see are supporting my hormones because based on my period. So I consume MCTs in my coffee. This has always been normal, but I do consume MCTs in my coffee just to supply calories in the morning, and I don't really view them as breaking my fast. Just as far as our liver is concerned, we're still in the fasted state. I'm supplying calories, and that's sparing my own body fat, but I actually just don't think that it's really breaking a fast in terms of like ketosis. If anything, it's supporting ketosis. Yeah. So I might be negating some of the benefits of fasting, but for me, it's what my body needs, and fasting throughout that morning and extending that overnight fast for me is just not what my body needs at this time. I think it's very applicable for a lot of people, but for me, I don't need that extra fat loss. So I'm sparing my body fat by having MCTs in my coffee. I eat more in my eating window. So I've increased my calories. I started looking at how much I was eating, and I was like, oh, duh, obviously I'm underweight. I'm not eating enough.
Yeah.
But I was eating like such quality foods, and so I was very full all the time. So I never felt restrictive, and to me, that's like, oh, okay, this is a great weight loss diet. This is what people should be eating. Yeah. But anyway, so it wasn't working for me. But anyway, the way I've changed my routine is just to have fats in the morning, eat more calories during my eating window, and I still eat within like a 6 to 8 hour window. And that's been working for me. I'm maintaining my weight, and yeah, my period's becoming regular. So for me, it was all about gaining weight. And now also I'm not afraid of eating carbs. Like I was following a strict ketogenic diet for almost 2 years, and then I started eating carbs again, and it was weird to like accept. Not that I ever like feared like I've never had a fear around foods, but it was just weird for me to be like, okay, I'm kicking myself out of ketosis on purpose. Like it's like, and my new view on diet is that, and the ketogenic diet for women is more so that carbohydrates are part of it. It's not you falling off of keto. This is part of keto. Like this is part of the ketogenic lifestyle that makes it work. This is why keto works for you long term, is because you're having these carbs. So it's not separated. It's part of it, is the way I'm looking at it.
I love that.
And I think that you clearly, this is what you do with your clients, and we're seeing more of a trend for increasing carbs and having carb cycling for women because maybe we all started the ketogenic diet at the same time. Everyone had the same problems. And then now we're like learning, okay, we have to reel it in and maybe normalize our hormones with these periodic cycles of carbohydrates. And I know you've had people on here talk about this, and I'm not the expert, like Ali Miller and Jaime Seeman. If people want to go back, go listen to Rachel's episodes with them.
Link them in the show notes. Thanks, Kristi.
But that's what I've been doing for myself, and I haven't been doing it strategically. I know that Ali Miller says like on day 4 or 5 or 19-20 of your cycle to increase carbs based on leptin. I've just been not thinking about it. I've been so unstrategic about my diet, and that's way more freeing for me too mentally, just to be like, okay, if I'm going home for a family dinner and they're serving sweet potato fries, I can have it. Doesn't matter what day in my cycle I'm on. It's just nice to know that you can have carbs and you're actually making yourself healthier.
Yeah. And I think it all comes back to kind of like, and it's not like you said, you weren't kind of just pushing off carbs and like fearing them, but it was just like inherently and this is what happened to me too, like as I just kind of adopted a lower carb lifestyle, it was like I just wasn't eating that many carbs. And so then I did become what I call, or people call, carb phobic, because it's just like if you don't have something in your everyday and then you introduce it, it's like, oh, this is out of my normalcy, right? Like you create your own normal, and over time that, what's your normal, right, keto, which might not be someone else's normal, but that's your normal, right? And so when you bring an outside factor in, then it's not normal anymore for you. I think that is like, I mean, that's kind of the whole, again, this whole metabolic flexibility, like allowing, I hate using the word allowing, but like experimenting with these different things and bringing different things in so that you can be as flexible as possible and that your normalcy is the flexibility that works for you, if that makes sense, right?
Yeah,
Like
totally.
being able to fast and, get into ketosis, but then also bringing carbs in at certain times for certain reasons. Like that's the whole crux of being metabolically flexible. And if you're on, and I talked about this last week, or a few weeks ago, I posted about living in the extremes. And being so extreme and on one end where maybe like for example being so maybe carnivore, right, is an extreme, and then the other end is like having tons and tons of carbs, right? Living on the extremes may work for some people, right? Like some people may go carnivore forever and love it and have no issues, and maybe they don't need to incorporate carbs or vegetables or whatever, and that's their new normal, right? Maybe it's not extreme for them anymore, but for someone else, maybe they try that. For me, example, maybe I tried it for 30 days and yeah, I saw some benefits, but it was a little bit too extreme for me, so I needed to dial it back, right? And then the same goes with the other end. And it's just like a lot of people kind of look at diet as in the extremes, like I have to be keto or I have to be carnivore or whatever, but it's like, no, you need to find, what works for you in this kind of spectrum and be able to kind of float throughout the spectrum for you, right? And not be on those extremes. And again, it comes back to like an extreme for you may not be an extreme for me and vice versa, right? So
Yeah.
that just means everybody's different and different things work for different people. But anyway, now I'm just going down a rabbit hole.
Wait, I want to add something though.
Yeah.
And we have to respect the fact that the body is so incredibly adaptable. So if you're on a high carb, low fat, plant-based diet or something, you're going to be a really good carb burner. You're going to upregulate the enzymes, the transporters, everything you need to burn carbs really well. And on the other end of the spectrum, if you're in a ketogenic diet, you're going to be a really good fat burner. And over time, you're going to be a really good ketone burner. And we upregulate the transporters, the enzymes, everything to burn fat and ketones. And we actually downregulate the ones that we use glucose for. So we know that long-term ketosis is associated with the downregulation of PDH, which is part of the enzymatic pathway to use glucose as fuel. And that's really good in the context of someone with a disease management where they need to use a ketogenic diet. It doesn't matter to them if they downregulate their pathways for glucose because they're going to stay on a ketogenic diet for life, like something like GLUT1 deficiency syndrome where they have to be on a ketogenic diet. But for someone just average person wanting to maintain metabolic health throughout life, then they might want to make sure that they don't lose or downregulate those pathways so far that they become physiologically insulin resistant, which is really circulating in the social media space right now as a consequence of long-term ketosis. And I think there is a reason to it, and like reason to believe in adding carbs in for that reason, because we do want to promote metabolic flexibility. And I really love that you've rebranded this way because it is so important. And for us, metabolic flexibility means adding in carbs. For most people, metabolic flexibility will mean intermittent ketosis. So we find it really easy to sustain a ketogenic diet long term, and we have to add in carbs. Most people would probably, if they just ate like a whole foods diet and then didn't worry about macronutrients, but then they did intermittent ketosis, which that they could achieve with just intermittent ketogenic diet or just intermittent fasting here and there, or like a periodic prolonged fast or something like that. You're still getting into that state of ketosis and you're going to be promoting metabolic flexibility that way. And I think that that's actually a very practical and sustainable approach for most people to achieve. And it's just promoting those pathways to use whatever fuel we throw at it, because at the end of the day, basically every chronic disease is associated with metabolic inflexibility, associated with insulin resistance, associated with systemic inflammation, basically synonymous with metabolic syndrome as a whole. So if we're avoiding that metabolic inflexibility, then I think we're just stacking the cards in our favor against preventing chronic disease.
Yeah. Couldn't have said it any better. I might need you to come on as my co-host for this show because you were like so knowledgeable in all this.
Oh man. Okay, don't ask me too hard questions then to expose me.
You're awesome. So I did actually, I wanted to kind of go back really quick to when you did increase your calories for your period, because I did have a question.
Yeah.
So you increase them via carbs, but, and this is something that I don't think a lot of like people think about too, in terms of like, we talk like calories versus macronutrients and things like that. Do you think that the carbs played a role in helping you to regain your period, or do you feel like it was just because you increased your calorie intake, right, and gained the body fat, that
Right.
is what did it?
So that's a good question because I actually think I've been asking myself the same thing and there's no way to know because I
Yeah.
did both at the same time. However, I will say when I was getting my period throughout my journey on a strict ketogenic diet, it was always just when I was eating more calories,
Mm-hmm.
which I wasn't eating carbs. It was just increasing my calories on a ketogenic diet. Um, but I decided to add in carbs at the same time just because I was like, I need to fix this for life. Like I need
Mm-hmm.
this to improve. I'm gonna just put all my eggs in one basket, and by all my eggs I mean 2 calories and carbs, um, and just gain the weight that I needed.
Yeah.
And it was just a time for me to be like, okay, let's let go of all the restrictions that I had on myself. Even I will again will say I wasn't like putting restrictions on myself. This is all just I really like eating a ketogenic diet. And I study it like on myself. I do blood testing all the time to test different products and see if they're ketogenic or not. So it helps being in a state of ketosis and being keto adapted to be able to test if something is ketogenic.
Mm-hmm.
Anyways, that's besides the point. But yeah, I don't know. I would actually say that it was more to do with my body fat percentage than carbs itself, but I'm sure carbs were playing a role. And who knows, because I could have been adapting to a ketogenic diet that whole time. Um, and maybe my leptin was like being suppressed so much, or just those uh, triggering a release of insulin periodically will have lots of benefits on our hypothalamic pituitary ovarian axis. So I think that carbs were playing a role in just triggering insulin, triggering all of these growth hormones that I'd probably been suppressing for so
Mm-hmm.
long. And I think that those growth hormones do really play a role in our fertility because at the end of the day, our body doesn't want to feel like it's in starvation. So if carbs are playing a role in triggering these growth hormones, then I would say that yes, they're playing a role, but also my body fat was 100% part of it because I could have been eating carbs and still maintaining my body fat percentage at a
Mm-hmm.
low weight. And I don't think I would have got my period back. So I think it was a combination of the two. But yeah, I can't separate them just because I don't know.
No, yeah, but I think that was, wow, sorry. I think that was a really good kind of segue into this idea that, you know, carbs do, in terms of insulin, right? Where I feel like, especially with a lot of people and a lot of clients that I work with, it's like, I don't want to raise my insulin. Like, insulin, I've heard that, you know, you should have it, like, insulin resistance is the issue, right? But, like, a lot of people don't understand the concept of insulin resistance and how it's not just, you know, high insulin or like if your blood sugar spikes and things like that. Like there's other pieces to that and we can talk about that. But I think like what you said in terms of spiking that insulin, and when you do that, other things happen in your body, right? So for example, like if you spike your insulin, usually cortisol drops, and cortisol is our stress, our chronic stress hormone, right? So if you are chronically stressed, if your cortisol is like chronically high, due to all different factors, even, you know, having a lower body fat, or you know, just like you said, chronically suppressing insulin, sometimes those things play a factor. And the reason I'm saying this is just because it's so complex. Like everything is so complex
Right.
and everybody's so different too. And I do think though that with women specifically, like we do have more complex hormones than men do.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that there is something with that. And then also looking at like activity level and things like that. Like you are an athlete, like you CrossFit and all of that. So that plays a role too. But just kind of wrapping up the whole, like this whole part of it, I think that it's just super important to, and this is something that because I've had irregular periods like throughout my life too. And I actually had an experience similar to yours when I did go keto. I started feeling like I started getting it more regularly. And then I stopped, right? And then I was like, right, I need to change things up. And so it's all an experiment. And I also think with us, like we're very active and doing, you know, even CrossFit, like high intensity. And I think also That in itself can also be an issue for a lot of women too, who are, maybe they're not getting their period and they're like doing high intensity exercise every single day. They're not eating enough. They're not supporting the fuel that they're not consuming the fuel they need to support that. And so like we can just go down that rabbit hole, but I think you really you touched on it. And I do want to kind of transition into like this concept of metabolic flexibility, and you kind of touched on it already, but in terms of like ketosis itself, like what are some of the benefits in terms of the research that you've done with like being in a state of ketosis and kind of like with disease prevention and all of that? I know this is like a really loaded question, but like I guess kind of going back to the and we can talk about this too, like people hear the concept of like ketones being a cleaner source of fuel for your body. Like is that true? Like what's kind of the science behind that? Maybe we can talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. So I'll just start off by why I even believe in a ketogenic diet and the metabolic state of ketosis as being so therapeutic. I just find it fascinating that most, if not all, chronic diseases have these underlying features that I already mentioned before, like insulin resistance, metabolic inflexibility, systemic inflammation, oxidative stress. So these features are across the board affecting all of these chronic diseases, from neurodegeneration to PCOS to cancer to like all these things that seemingly have nothing to do with each other, but they all have these same similar features. So I just think that is such a telling sign that there's something deep rooted in our metabolism that's deranged, and that's influencing these disease states. And then when you get into the mechanisms of ketosis, then you kind of understand why ketosis is so therapeutic for these states. And when we have entire scientific conferences dedicated to metabolic health and have symposiums on all of these different parts of the body, it just, I don't know, it just makes me so passionate about metabolic health as a preventative strategy for life. And it's so hard to communicate preventative medicine or preventative strategies in life because people just don't get it. There's no immediate gratification. There's nothing they're trying to fix. It's like, do this because it'll prevent this 30 years down the road. But people aren't motivated by something 30 years away. But that's kind of becoming my new mission, is to just encourage people to take care of their health in the now so that they don't have to worry about it when it's later. Because I am so passionate about improving health span that because end age care, whatever it's called, end life care. Yeah. Like ending your life in a nursing home is honestly the most depressing thing I could think of. That is not something I want for myself. It's not something I want for any of my family members. It's not something I want for any of my friends. So if we can just minimize our risk of chronic disease and debilitating diseases, we're just improving everyone's quality of life, including ours. And it's so practical to promote metabolic flexibility, metabolic health while you're young. And there's just like really easy ways to do it. That it just like you're stacking the cards in your favor and there's just no downfalls to it. But anyways, that was just my passion rant.
Love it. Yeah.
So when you say like ketones as a cleaner source of fuel, and a lot of people say this, they're like superior to glucose, which there is, if you look in terms of the metabolism of ketones, they do have superiority, like as in they have a greater heat of combustion. They're more metabolically efficient, so they produce more ATP per molecule of oxygen. So this all comes down to the electron transport chain inside all of our mitochondria. So we're oxidizing part of one of the coenzyme Q, and this has downstream effects on the amount of reactive oxygen species that our cells produce. And so reactive oxygen species, this is an inevitable part of metabolism. So whether you're burning glucose or ketones, you're producing reactive oxygen species. But once those ROS, I'm going to just abbreviate to ROS, once ROS accumulates past the point of our antioxidant potential of our cells, this leads to oxidative stress. And oxidative stress our cells are very vulnerable to oxidative stress. So especially our mitochondrial DNA that has no protection like our nuclear DNA has. So these ROS can basically damage our mitochondrial DNA. They can damage our lipid bilayers of our cell. They can damage our nuclear DNA as well. And this can facilitate things like cancer. So cancer is associated with genomic instability. And people there's like a debate of whether cancer is rooted in genetics, oh my gosh, genetics, or if it's rooted in metabolism. So if it's a metabolic disease or a genetic disease. But I would say it's a combination of the two. Like our metabolism is promoting these genetic abnormalities. But anyways, so when we're burning ketones, we're producing less ROS based on just the metabolism of ketones, but we're also upregulating our antioxidant defenses in our cells. So we're promoting more glutathione, which is our master antioxidant in our cells, and we're also encouraging epigenetic changes by HDAC inhibition, which upregulates the gene, the FOXO genes, and those are part of our antioxidant defense systems as well. So it's like a double whammy. We're producing less ROS, but we're also promoting our antioxidant defenses. So when people say cleaner fuel, I would say that they're referring to the amount of ROS that are being produced by our mitochondria. So I think that's what people mean by them being a cleaner or more superior fuel.
Okay, yeah, that makes total sense. So I do want to chat, kind of lastly, we're coming down to the hour now, in terms of exogenous ketones. So I know you've done a little bit of research or maybe a lot of research in this area, especially with Dom, because I know he's done a lot with like Navy SEALs and stuff like that, and implementing exogenous ketones for that specific area. We don't have to go down that rabbit hole, but just in terms of exogenous ketones in general, I feel like there's a lot of like misunderstanding behind them. Can you give us maybe like your views on exogenous ketones based off the research you've done, and like who may benefit from using them? We don't have to go into like all the science of them and like all the different types and all that, but maybe just like give us kind of what you found.
Yeah. So when it comes to exogenous ketones, there's several different types. So the main three types are just ketogenic agents, which aren't technically exogenous ketones, but they're things like MCTs or 1,3-butanediol, which once you ingest them, our liver converts them to beta-hydroxybutyrate or ketone bodies. But there's also ketone salts and ketone esters, and these are the more what people think of exogenous ketones. So ketone salts are the most widely available, and that's what most people are consuming. And they're just basically a ketone body bound to a mineral ion or a charged amino acid. And usually it's just like an electrolyte balance of sodium, potassium, magnesium, and calcium. And that's what you get in like Perfect Keto products or all these ketone salts. But there's also ketone esters, and this is just a ketone body bound to a ketone precursor. So right now, I think it's only like the available ones are 1,3-butanediol. So this, once we ingest a ketone ester, we get the ketone body, but we also get a ketone precursor. So we're getting like 2 molecules of BHB basically. And beta-hydroxybutyrate is just the primary ketone body that our bodies produce in ketosis. So in terms of their potency, MCTs are probably going to be the lower. Ketone salts are probably in the intermediate, and ketone esters are the most potent. So they're also the most expensive, the most unpalatable. Not many people are taking ketone esters, but they do raise blood BHB levels about 50% more than ketone salts. However, Dom's lab has showed that mixing ketone salts and MCTs together increases the amount of ketone bodies in your blood, but also prolongs it. So if you wanted to kind of like biohack your ketone salts, if they're not already a mix of MCTs, then you could just add MCTs to it. But those are the 3 primary types of exogenous ketones, and their applications are basically endless. Any disease state or any condition that would benefit from nutritional ketosis, which is induced by diet, would probably benefit from exogenous ketones. And there's even applications where you would have exogenous ketones with a higher carb diet, with something like athletic performance. Most of the studies using exogenous ketones for athletic performance are in the context of a high carb, just like a normal standard diet. So if we're like referencing these studies where they show exogenous ketones are superior to not just the control, well, that's in the context of we also have carbohydrates. So the difference between like nutritional ketosis and exogenous ketosis is based on our liver glycogen. So nutritional ketosis will be in the glycogen deplete state, and then exogenous ketosis will, with a high carb diet, will be in the glycogen replete state, and that might have applications for sports performance that relies on that glycolytic activity, but also might have a portion of it being more endurance and aerobic based. So
like CrossFit.
Yeah, like if there's like longer term runs or something where like you are relying on your aerobic metabolism and fatty acid metabolism, which would also would benefit from ketosis, then there could be applications. I'm thinking like, so endurance,
more endurance,
yeah, exogenous ketones would favor endurance performance for sure because it's more reliant on fat, but then maybe having glycogen stores would like give you that boost if you had to like sprint up a hill or like cycle up a hill or sprint at the end.
Exactly.
Where you can have access to both fuels, but it is a novel state to the body. Like we're not used to having both glucose and ketones. And I should mention that when you take exogenous ketones, your blood glucose actually lowers, so there is a glucose lowering effect to ketones, and this probably just has to do with preventing acidosis because we don't want high ketones and high glucose in the body, but I don't know. The mechanisms are not discovered yet for why we lower blood glucose. But anyways, my point is that if you take exogenous ketones, you're not having high blood glucose and high ketones at the same time. But in terms of their applications with a ketogenic diet, I think that they complement a ketogenic diet well, and especially therapeutically, because if there's a child that needs to be in a therapeutic state of ketosis and can't handle the restrictive nature of the diet, or a patient, any age. I don't know why I said children, any age. People are going to struggle with dietary compliance when they don't really understand the diet. So that's where exogenous ketones will come in as a very therapeutic agent. And I think that they can help a lot of conditions that would benefit from nutritional ketosis. And we see more and more research coming out because there's benefits to ketone bodies themselves. So independent of metabolism, we know that ketone bodies are a signaling metabolite. So this means that they act almost like a hormone in our body. They cause changes in our epigenetics. So they're turning on or turning off certain genes. They're influencing our immunity. So we know that BHB can inhibit the NLRP3 inflammasome. Not going to get too scientific here, but basically it's like the hub of our body's inflammation, and it sends out inflammatory cytokines, which contributes to systemic inflammation. So if we could take something that's inhibiting that pathway, then maybe we could lower systemic inflammation, which is also an underlying feature of so many chronic diseases. So there's just a really wide range of applications for exogenous ketones, and I think it's really cool. It's a really cool area of research because it's so new. The ketone ester only became available in 2016, so it's only been 4 years, and there's more and more research coming out. I actually just read a paper yesterday using exogenous ketones in people, like healthy adults, and seeing at what age their brain starts deteriorating in terms of brain glucose hypometabolism, being an underlying feature of dementia. And I thought it was really cool because they did 3 separate experiments, one with the ketogenic diet, one with an overnight fast plus ketone ester, and then one with a standard diet plus ketone ester. So they showed in all 3 scenarios that the brain was more stabilized when the ketones were present, meaning that it was ketones that were the actual directly affecting the stabilization in the brain, and they were preventing destabilization in the brain, which was promoted by high glucose, or actually just normal glucose. It wasn't even high glucose, just normal glucose. The brain was unstabilized. And then when they added ketones, it was more stabilized, which was a marker for less neurodegeneration. So that's also part of why I'm so passionate about preventative medicine, because if we have this energy deficit in the brain, we could be supplying something so easy as exogenous ketones or just NCTs in our coffee in the morning. It makes for a delicious, frothy, creamy coffee, and you could be filling that energy gap in your brain that you might not even know is there because it happens decades before the symptoms of cognitive decline. So if you were just filling that energy gap, your brain wasn't starving anymore, and you could prevent that neurodegeneration rooted in hypometabolism, glucose hypometabolism, then I don't know, it's just a very easy, preventable thing. And I think people should utilize the power of ketones earlier in life because there's just no downfall to going into periodic states of ketosis. And I love how Dom always says that people argue a state of ketosis is unnatural, but he argues that not going into a state of ketosis is even more unnatural. So I think there's a lot of rationale for these going into a state of ketosis, for metabolic flexibility, for promoting insulin sensitivity, and just overall health. I'm out of breath.
Yeah, that was good. I agree. And again, it all comes back to like being flexible, getting back to that metabolic flexibility, being able to go into ketosis at times. I personally don't utilize ketones that much. I'm just like, I kind of like when there's only so much that you can focus on, right? In terms of like your own research and things like that. So you're sparking me to definitely dive into a little bit more, just because like recently I haven't been focused on like diving into the research on ketones. And I also think that it is, like you said, like it's very, very new. So I'm super intrigued to learn more about it. I do think that there was kind of like when all the exogenous ketones started to come to market and like all these companies started to produce them, it's like they would market them as this quick fat loss tool. And then I think that put a really sour taste in a lot of people's mouths, so to say, and then gave exogenous ketones kind of like this really bad rap. And I think that if you are looking at them as, you know, if you're someone who's like, oh, I'm just going to drink the exogenous ketones and eat crap, and again, in the context of trying to lose body fat, which is what a lot of the clients I work with are shooting for, you know, and many people in America. There's probably a reason for that too, because of the American diet, standard American diet. Anyway, but I think that there's just so much misinformation about exogenous ketones, and I think like the research you're doing is super beneficial. And I think if people don't look at it in the sense of, oh, I'm just going to drink this because then it'll allow me to eat all these other foods, that is like complete opposite of what you're saying. It's like
totally
you're doing this for so many other reasons. So if you
yes,
have...
I should have added in the caveat that exogenous ketones are no replacement for a healthy diet.
Yeah. No, I love that. And yeah, and I think it just like it's a little bit complex, and I think the research is starting to come out more, like you said. There's papers and research coming out more and more. So I'm excited to see kind of like over the next few years like what comes of that. So super interesting. But anyway, we are getting a little bit long, so I do want to wrap up. I think we hit on a lot of really cool subjects. I say this with like a lot of people, but I feel like I always want to do like a part 2 or part 3 because there's other questions that I want to ask. And anyway, so maybe we'll have to do that. But I do want to end with one question that I always ask. So is there anything that you've changed your mind about in the last year, and why?
Okay. Wait, I have 2 things.
Okay.
One is my view on meat in the diet. So I always just had a bad taste in my mouth because meat is so demonized. So that's something I've changed my mind about, and now I eat a predominantly animal-based diet. Second would be my view on carbohydrates. So I definitely see them more as a tool in the diet and not something that are inherently dangerous. I didn't really think that before, but I'm more open to carbohydrates in the diet with periodic states of ketosis. Like there's a whole context specific to how I view carbohydrates, but also I'm just more open to learning about the other side. So I know that there are there's obviously populations that eat very high carbohydrate diets who are very healthy, and we can learn a lot from those ancestral diets and see what those really what the simple truths are. Because if we looked at like a diet, an ancestral diet that ate very low carb and high fat, we could extrapolate from that and be like, oh, that's the right diet we should be following. But then if we looked at another diet that ate only sweet potatoes and maybe a little bit of fish or something like that, then we'd be like, oh, well, that's the right diet. But I think that we're not going to find the right diet by looking for these simple answers. We're going to have to look at them all, and then we're going to have to pull the simple truths that belong to them all, which in my opinion is basically just whole foods diet. So whether it comes from the earth, whether it's an animal or a plant, doesn't matter. There's no civilizations that functioned on a purely vegan diet or a purely carnivore diet that I am aware of. So whole foods, there's going to be periods without food. So I just really can't picture any sort of evolutionary society that was living with food access all the time. We were going through periods of of fasting. And I think we can mimic that a lot in our daily lives with just intermittent fasting and periodic prolonged fasting. So there's these little simple truths that I think we can pull from all these ancestral diets, but I think I'm more open-minded to the fact that there are just a lot of different ways you can promote metabolic health.
I love that. That was awesome. Little simple truths. I love that. Sweet. All right. So do you want to tell our listeners where they can find you on your website, social media, all that jazz?
Yeah. So I'm on Instagram. It's my full name, Kristi Storoschuk. I won't even spell that out, but
I'll link it.
You can try. I'll see how many people actually find me. And my website is getOldSlowly.com. So I'm going to be really pivoting and focusing all of my content around longevity and improving health span.
I love it. I love that. What's the website called again?
getOldSlowly.com. So I have a shirt that me and Dom's lab manager made, and it says "Get old slowly, die fast," because that's my goal in life, is to just age really slowly. And then when I'm done with life and I've done my time, I want to die fast. I'm not going to be dying in a hospital bed for months on end. That is not fun. So get old slowly, die fast, people.
That is a really good slogan. I will definitely buy that shirt. Awesome. All right. I will link all that in the show notes so everybody can check that out. But this was fun. Thank you so much for coming on and sharing everything. Like, I learned a lot, and I hope our listeners did too. So again, probably have to have you back for another part 2 or beyond, and grill you on a few other questions that I had that I didn't get to. So we'll schedule that.
Okay, I hope so. This was really fun. Hopefully I didn't talk too fast. I know I talk really fast. So anyways, hope it was awesome. All are having a great day, and thanks for having me, Rachel.
All right, I'll talk to you soon.
Okay,
bye.